Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Good morning, everybody. Okay, we are now in chapter 9 of the book In the Buddha's Words. And last time we finished the section on the 5 aggregates, and now we come to the section on the 6 sense bases. And if you remember, in this section on the development of wisdom, I had prepared a table which I introduced in an earlier class, which shows how the development of wisdom, according to the early discourses of the Buddha, is based upon what I would call the intersection of 2 factors. One is the factor of the contents, and so under the contents we have the different ways in which the Buddha organizes experience into certain groups, certain schemes of classification, which are then used as the basis for insight. Okay, so the primary schemes of classification that we meet in these suttas are the 5 aggregates, the 6 or 12 sense bases, the 6 or 18 elements, and then sometimes feelings and faculties. Okay, and then the patterns into which these groups of factors are organized include the pattern of the 4 Noble Truths, the pattern of impermanence, suffering and non-self, then what I call the gratification triad, gratification, danger, and escape, and then an expansion of the gratification triad into the arising, passing away, gratification, danger, and escape. Last time, or maybe it was the time before that, we had distributed a table which shows this particular way of understanding the early discourses. Did everybody get that table? Oh, and then not only did I make up the table, but I also cited the suttas in which we find examples of these schemes of contemplation. Okay, so over the last couple of weeks I dealt with the 5 aggregates. The 5 aggregates is the most frequently met scheme in the suttas. But there's another scheme which we find alongside the 5 aggregates, which also figures very prominently in the discourses. And this is the scheme of the 6 sense bases. The 6 sense bases are the 6 faculties, which are called bases. The Pali word is ayatana, because these are the bases for the arising of consciousness. Okay, so the 6 bases are the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body. Those are the 5 material or physical sense bases. And then there is the mano. The mano is the mind base. This is the base for, call this reflective consciousness, internal consciousness, the consciousness that's aware of ideas, images, purely mental objects. Okay, now the 6 sense bases are sometimes expanded into 12 sense bases. We get the 12 sense bases by taking internal sense bases and external sense bases. So I just mentioned the 6 internal sense bases, and the 6 external sense bases are their corresponding objects. So we have the eye and forms, ear and sounds, nose and odors, tongue and taste, the body and maybe we can call this textures or touch sensations, and then mind and purely mental objects. Okay, now these 6 sense bases play several important roles in the Buddha's teaching. We see already, even in an early stage of training, particularly this is in the monastic training, the Buddha speaks about indriya samvara, which means restraint of the sense faculties. So we met this passage much earlier when we were discussing the step-by-step training of the Buddhist monk. We have this on page 246 in paragraph 15. The Buddha says that here the monk who's training, on seeing a form with the eye, does not grasp at its signs and features. If he left the eye faculty unguarded, then evil, unwholesome states of longing and dejection, or craving and aversion, might invade him. And so therefore he practices the way of its restraint. He guards the eye faculty. He undertakes restraint of the eye faculty. And so the same thing is repeated for each of the other 5 sense faculties. So these 6 sense bases or 6 sense faculties are given special prominence by the Buddha even in this early stage of training, because it's the 6 sense faculties are the 6 doors through which experience becomes accessible to the mind. And if one doesn't exercise control over the sense faculties, then the sense faculties will grasp upon an object in a diluted or distorted way. And then this distorted grasp of the object becomes the trigger that originates unwholesome states of mind. Liking, disliking, attachment, repulsion, attraction and aversion. So, even when preparing the mind to practice meditation, in this early stage, one controls the reactions of the senses to their objects. Okay, but then after fulfilling the requirements of concentration, samadhi, when one turns to the development of insight, one also has to understand the sense bases. And the sense bases become a theme for understanding because they play not only a prominent role in generating states of craving and aversion, but also looking at the sense bases very deeply in the Buddha's teaching. We find that the sense bases, according to the Buddha, are actually the place where the world originates. There's an interesting sutta that occurs both in the Samyutta Nikaya and in the Sutta Nipata. It's called the Hemavata Sutta, where some deity comes to the Buddha and asks a series of questions. He asks, where has the world arisen? With what does the world form intimate bonds? By clinging to what does the world stand? By what is the world troubled or harmed? Then the Buddha answers in a somewhat cryptic way. He says, in 6 the world has arisen. With 6 the world forms intimate bonds. By clinging to 6 the world stands. By 6 the world is troubled. No other explanation is given in the sutta itself, but when we have other suttas as guidelines, then we could understand that what is being referred to here are the 6 internal sense bases and the 6 external sense bases. We can get support for this from a sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya. This is chapter 35, sutta number 107. And the same sutta occurs again in the Samyutta Nikaya as chapter 12, number 44. Here the Buddha raises the question, what is the origin and passing away of the world? So this is a question which has stimulated the thought of philosophers in all of the continents of the world. What is the origin of the world? How has the world arisen? And here the Buddha explains how the world arises with reference to the 6 sense bases. He says, in dependence upon the eye and visible forms, there arises eye consciousness. The meeting of the 3 is contact. In dependence upon contact, there arises feeling. In dependence upon feeling, there arises craving. In dependence upon craving, there is clinging. In dependence upon clinging, there is becoming or existence. In dependence upon becoming, there is birth. In dependence upon birth, there is old age, sickness, and death. So this is how the world originates. And so this is not explaining the first point to the world, because the Buddha says that we can never discover a first point to the world. We can never find any kind of creation in time. But constantly, moment by moment, there is taking place within us contact between, or we could say the encounter of the 6 senses with their objects. This encounter of this one sense object with one sense faculty gives rise to consciousness. And then it is through this contact of consciousness with its object that there arises feeling. Okay, this much is given, necessarily given by experience. Once we come into the world, we necessarily have to undergo this process of making contact with sense objects, and through the contact experiencing feelings. But it's with the next step that we take this jump into the new creation of the world, or the bringing into being of new realms of existence, new possibilities of existence through infinite time. And that jump, that step, is the step from feeling to craving, and then from craving to clinging. Through our clinging, we create the karmic formations that lead to new birth. Once we come again into a new birth, again, this new birth means the acquiring of the 6 sense faculties, or 6 sense bases. Once we acquire the new set of 6 sense bases, there will be more contacts, more consciousness, more feeling, and then again, when we surrender to the feeling and allow it to trigger craving and clinging, we will create, originate, bring into being still new states of existence. So this is the origin of the world, and then the Buddha teaches what is the passing away of the world, or how does one gain liberation from the world. He starts off in the same way. Independence upon the I and forms, I consciousness arises. The meeting of the 3, the meeting of consciousness with this object through the I, that is contact. Independence upon contact, there is feeling. But with the stopping of craving, there is the stopping of clinging. When clinging stops, becoming ceases. With the cessation of becoming, there is no further birth, and with the end of birth, no further old age, sickness, death, and suffering. That, the Buddha says, that is the passing away of the world, the ending of the world, or liberation from the world. And so everything in it, the whole, you could say everything, the whole presentation of a world depends upon our responses to the objects of the senses. And the possibility of liberation depends upon mastering our responses to the objects. There is a sutta that occurs also in the Samyutta Nikaya. It's called the Rohitassa Sutta. It's chapter 2, sutta number 23. In the sutta, a deity by the name of Rohitassa comes to the Buddha and asks the Buddha, how does one reach the end of the world? Then the Buddha replies to him, he says, it's not by traveling. The deity asks, how does one reach the end of the world where there is no more birth, aging, and death? Then the Buddha replies, it's not by traveling that one can reach the end of the world where there's no more birth, aging, and death. When the Buddha says this, then Rohitassa becomes very happy. And he says, this is true, Venerable. He says, in the past, one time in the past, he made a decision to reach the end of the world, to travel to the end of the world. And because he's a deity, he could travel very quickly. And so, day after day, he would just travel continuously through the whole day, stopping only to take his meals. I guess the deities have to eat. And to go to I guess they have bathrooms in the heavens. He says just to stop in order to urinate and to defecate and to take rest. But the rest of the time, he just continuously traveled day after day, traveling very fast, almost at the speed of light. And he would travel continuously, month after month, year after year. And no matter how far he traveled, he never reached the end of the world. And so the Buddha said, that's the way it is. By traveling, you can never reach the end of the world. But the Buddha said, it's only when one reaches the end of the world that one can make an end of suffering. So then the deity was puzzled and said, well, if one can never reach the end of the world by traveling, then how does one reach the end of the world? Then the Buddha said, it is in this 6-foot-high body, endowed with its senses and consciousness, that I say there is the world, the origin of the world, the cessation of the world, and the path to the cessation of the world. So no matter where we might travel, now we have rockets going to the moon. Some people, rich people, are already reserving seats on these rockets to travel to the moon. Maybe in a few centuries we'll be able to travel. Well, actually, we could already send rockets to other planets, but maybe a century from now we'll be able to travel. Human beings, real human beings, can travel to other planets. Then if we survive beyond this without destroying our planet, destroying ourselves, maybe a few thousand years we'll be able to travel to other galaxies, then to other galaxy systems, always going further, 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 looking for the end of the world. But wherever we go, even if we reach the very edge of the Milky Way, then we see that there are still other galaxies beyond the Milky Way. And then we get these machines, maybe we'll have these machines which can transport us to the very edge of the known universe, but we still have our eyes, so finally we reach the edge, we look beyond, there'll be something beyond that. We have ears, we can hear what comes beyond. And so as long as we have the senses, there'll always be a world presented to us. But the Buddha says it is that in the world by which one is a perceiver of the world and a thinker of the world. This is called the world in the teaching of the Noble Ones. And so what is that in the world by which one is a perceiver and thinker of the world? The eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And so to bring an end to the world, or to gain complete liberation from the world, this is not to be done by traveling, not to be done by speculation, but is to be achieved by understanding, fully understanding these faculties that are the basis for the experience of the world. Okay, and so the Buddha emphasizes the need to understand the 6 sense bases. And so now we can come to the text. Now I'm on page 345. The Buddha says, without directly knowing and fully understanding the all, or everything. Here the Pali word is sabbang. So without fully understanding the all, without developing this passion towards the all and abandoning it, one is incapable of destroying suffering, or one is incapable of eliminating suffering. Now there's a sutta, a short sutta, that comes a little bit earlier in the Samyutta Nikaya. I think it's chapter 35, number 21 or 22. The sutta is called simply the All, Sabbang Sutta. And in the sutta the Buddha says, I will teach you the All. What is the All? The eye and forms, the ear and sounds, the nose and odors, the tongue and taste, the body and textures, and the mind and mental objects. This is the all. And if anybody, the Buddha continues, if anybody would say, I will put aside this all and teach some other all, that would not be possible. Okay, so this is the all in the Buddha's teaching. The 6 sense faculties and the 6 external sense bases. I don't think this means that the Buddha is what we call a philosophical idealist who just holds that the only thing that exists is the mind and things perceived by the mind. But rather I think what the Buddha is saying here is that this is what I'm concerned with in the teaching. This is what has to be understood in order to gain liberation. Okay, and so in this sutta, the sutta that I just referred to, the Buddha stops only with the 6 internal sense bases and the 6 external sense bases. But we find in other suttas that the Buddha develops this a little further, almost as though it seems like he's contradicting himself. Since he doesn't stop just with the internal sense bases and external sense bases, but he goes on to speak about the meeting of how in dependence upon the internal sense base and the external sense base there arises consciousness, then the meeting of consciousness with object through the sense faculty, that is contact. Depending upon contact, there's feeling. So, we could say that the 12 things that the Buddha mentions as being the all, the 6 internal sense bases, the 6 external sense bases, those are the bases for all experience. But beyond those 12 things, we have the factors that arise within experience through the interaction of objects and sense faculties. Okay, so here the Buddha speaks about without directly knowing and fully understanding the all. So here we have 2 words which are both related to knowledge, abhiññāya and pariññāya. Both words are based upon the root ñā, which means to know. But they differ because they have different prefixes. When we take abhi and put abhiññā, it gives the sense of a superior knowledge, a higher knowledge, and also a direct knowledge. So this is what we translate direct knowing or direct knowledge. Then when we take the prefix pari, the word pari gives a sense of fullness or completeness. So pariññāya is what is translated here as full understanding. And so these 2 words signify 2 different stages in the unfolding of wisdom, the development of wisdom. Abhinyaya comes with the first breakthrough to the understanding of the Four Noble Truths. And so when one makes this first breakthrough to the Four Noble Truths, which leads or brings the attainment of stream entry, the first stage of enlightenment, with that direct knowledge of the Four Noble Truths, one also directly knows the six sense bases, internal and external, and one knows that these six sense bases are part of the truth of dukkha, part of the truth of suffering. But even though one makes this breakthrough to direct knowledge of the Four Noble Truths, but there is still greed. One weakens greed, hatred, and delusion, but one doesn't completely eliminate them yet. There's still some greed, hatred, and delusion remaining. However, as one continues to develop the path, and then as one continues to develop the path, to develop wisdom, to develop insight, one's wisdom grows fuller, deeper, more comprehensive, until it reaches the stage of full understanding. And it's with full understanding that greed, hatred, and ignorance are eliminated. Okay, so as long as the six sense bases and their objects remain, there'll always be dukkha, according to the Buddha's teaching. It doesn't really mean that one is experiencing suffering in the sense of misery, unhappiness, sorrow, grief, worry, anxiety, stress. But there's some element of unsatisfactoriness. So that is this meaning of dukkha here. Okay, so then what one has to do is to directly know, to fully understand the all. With that full understanding, then one develops viraga. Viraga is dispassion. And then through dispassion there comes the abandoning. One doesn't actually abandon the six sense faculties at once, but what one abandons is the clinging to the six sense faculties and their objects. Okay, so then the Buddha raises the question, what is that all that one has to fully understand, that one has to directly know and fully understand? Then he answers, without directly knowing and fully understanding the I, without developing dispassion towards it and abandoning it, one is incapable of destroying suffering. Without directly knowing and fully understanding forms, I consciousness, eye contact, and whatever feeling arises with eye contact as condition, and so on, one is incapable of destroying suffering. Okay, so this is basically showing the chain of factors within dependent origination. Through the internal sense space, external sense space, there arise consciousness. The meeting of the three is contact. Contact gives rise to feeling. Normally, feeling will trigger craving, and then craving will maintain the cycle. the cycle of becoming. So what one has to do is to cut that link between feeling and craving. And what enables one to cut that link is direct knowledge and then full understanding. Okay, so the Buddha just then repeats the same thing with the other 6 sense faculties, and then he states it positively, by directly knowing and fully understanding the all, by developing dispassion towards it and abandoning it, that is the abandoning, the clinging to the all, one is capable of destroying suffering. Okay, then the next few suttas really just develop, we could say that the next few suttas just apply the 3 characteristics of existence to the 6 sense bases, doing so from somewhat different angles. When we come to text B, which is called burning or blazing, this is also popularly known as the Buddha's fire sermon. I think this sutta was partly quoted in T.S. Eliot's famous poem, The Wasteland. He has just the 3 words, burning, 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 and then that's supposed to have been an allusion to the Buddha's fire sermon. When the text speaks about burning, which of the 3 characteristics would be emphasized here? What? Yeah, if you put your hand on a hot stove, do you experience impermanence? Yeah, and there's a special reason why the Buddha gave this discourse on burning to these 1,000 monks. What is the reason? Anybody know? Oh, I gave the answer in a footnote. Okay, then you can't tell what it is. Does anybody else know who hasn't looked at the footnote?
There were other groups at the time who were worshipping fire.
Yeah.
And this was a rejoinder to that.
Yeah, very good. In fact, when we read, there's a section of the Vinaya, the book of discipline, called the Mahavagga, which gives an account of the early days of the Buddha's ministry or his teaching career. And this sutta, the fire sermon, occurs within that part of the Vinaya, and so we could see what the background to it is. The 1,000 monks who are mentioned here, and sometimes 1,000, we don't take these numbers literally, it just means a large number. These 1,000 monks had formerly been members of a sect that worshipped the sacred fire. And so this was their main spiritual practice, was to keep a special room in which they would maintain the sacred fire. And then every day they would make offerings to the sacred fire. The sacred fire. Actually, the word for fire in Pali is agni. But the Sanskrit word you might recognize, Agni. Agni was, in the Vedas, the ancient Brahminic scriptures, Agni is the god of fire. And so the word Agni came to be applied to fire itself, because the ancient Brahmins saw fire not just as a natural phenomena, but as a kind of manifestation or an epiphany, a divine revelation, a revelation of divine reality. And so wherever fire was burning, it was all a manifestation of this supreme divinity, Agni. And so even in the Buddha's time, hundreds of years later, 500 years, 1,000 years later, groups of ascetics were still worshipping the sacred fire as a manifestation of this divine reality. Okay, so the Buddha had seen that these groups of fire ascetics living in Gaya had the potential to become enlightened. And so he went to them, and there was a kind of contest of supernormal powers between the Buddha and the ascetics. And whenever the Buddha would demonstrate his psychic powers, these fire ascetics, the leaders at least, thought, I'm an arahant. He thought, I'm enlightened or liberated. And so the Buddha went to them and asked for permission to stay at their hermitage. He stayed there, and every time the Buddha would perform some kind of miraculous feat, supernormal feat. And whenever the fire ascetic, the chief of the fire ascetics, would see this, he would think, this visiting ascetic is very powerful, but he's not an arahant like me. And so this went on. The Buddha kept on performing one supernormal feat after another, and the chief of the fire ascetics kept on thinking, our visiting monk is very powerful, but he's not an arahant like me. Until finally, after about 5 or 6 displays of supernormal power, the Buddha thought, let me give it to him straight. And so when this chief ascetic gave rise to that thought, the Buddha read his mind and said to him, I'm telling you, Kassapa, that was his name, Kassapa, you are not an arahant, and you're not even on the path to arhatship. And so when the Buddha said this, then the fire ascetic, instead of getting angry or throwing the Buddha out, bowed down to the Buddha, because he recognized that indeed that the Buddha is the enlightened one. And then he said, please, sir, let me become your disciple. Okay, and then the Buddha said, come and live the holy life under me. And so he became a follower of the Buddha, and then all of his disciples also gave up their fire worshipping practices and became disciples of the Buddha. Okay, and this happened, the Buddha did this actually 3 times with 3 different groups of fire ascetics, till there were altogether 1,000 of them. Then they walked together to this place, Gaya, Gaya's head, and then the Buddha gave them the fire sermon. So he used the image of fire as a way to speak to them in terms with which they were familiar. So the Buddha says, everything is burning. What is everything that's burning? I, forms, consciousness, contact, whatever feeling arises, that too is burning. What is it burning? It's burning with the fires of lust, the fire of hatred, the fire of delusion, burning with birth, old age, and death, sorrow, limitation, pain, dejection, and despair, and so on. Okay, so you can just read this on. It's all just using the characteristic of dukkha, of suffering, through the image of a burning fire to expose the true nature of the 6 sense bases. The next sutta is called Suitable for Attaining Nibbana. The Buddha says, I will teach you a way or a practice that's suitable for attaining Nibbana. There's actually 3 separate suttas here, which I've joined together. The first is seeing all of these phenomena, I and forms, consciousness and so on, contact and feeling, seeing them all as impermanent. The second is seeing all of them as dukkha, bound up with suffering. And the third sutta is seeing them all as anatta, non-self. Okay, the next sutta is called Empty is the World. And this sutta is based upon a saying, perhaps that was being circulated by the Buddha, some of his disciples. Empty is the world. Here we have the word that's to play such a big role in later Buddhism. Okay, so the Pali for the expression empty is the world is sunnyo loko. And from this adjective sunya, which means empty, one gets the abstract noun sunyata in Pali, which in Sanskrit becomes shunyata. And that is what is translated as emptiness. And so already one could see the root. The idea of emptiness was to play, of course, the major role in the Prajnaparamita Sutras and then in the philosophy of Nagarjuna, 1st century or 2nd century South Indian philosopher. But already we can see the root of this idea of emptiness in the early Buddhist teaching in a sutta like this, where we have the expression sunnyo loko. Empty is the world. So Ananda comes to the Buddha and recites that phrase and then asks, in what way or for what reason is it said, empty is the world? Then the Buddha answers, it is because it is empty of a self and of what belongs to self that it is said, the world is empty, or empty is the world. Okay, so this is the basic meaning of emptiness, that things are empty or devoid of any kind of substantial selfhood, any kind of substance, substantial reality, or of anything that belongs to self, anything that could truly be taken as being mine. Okay, but what is the world that is said to be empty? And here the Buddha answers with reference to the 6 sense bases and to everything that arises from them. So the I is empty of self and of what belongs to self. Forms, visible forms, are empty of I, of self, and what belongs to self. I consciousness is empty. I contact is empty. Whatever feeling arises is empty of self and of what belongs to self. And then the same is repeated in regard to all of the other sense bases and their objects. So when the world is said to be empty, it means that all the factors of experience, sense bases, internal, external, consciousness and so on, they're all empty of selfhood. There's nothing in them to be taken as I, mine, or self. Okay, maybe I'll ask if there's any questions at this point. Okay, please. Your worship.
You mentioned that as long as the 6 sense bases, you have the 6 sense bases, there is Buddha. Is that correct?
Say again?
As long as the six sense spaces are operating, then
Yeah.
dukkha is present.
Yeah,
And yet, so as long as you have a body and living, then
Yeah.
dukkha is present. Yet, doesn't the end then can't suffering end in this life?
Okay, maybe repeat. I heard the question, but maybe just for the sake of the recording, if you repeat it with the microphone.
You mentioned that as long as the six sense spaces are active, then dukkha is present.
Yeah,
And yet, I'm confused because I think I understood that dukkha can end in this life.
yeah.
How do I resolve that?
Okay. The way I would understand it is this way. What the dukkha that one could fully end in this life will be all the types of disagreeable feelings, disagreeable mind states that arise based upon greed, hatred, and delusion. So any kind of mind state like worry, distress, anxiety, sorrow, grief, concern, worry, lamentation, dejection, despair, all of those would be completely ended. Okay, but as long as the body with its six sense faculties stands, one is still exposed to the possibility of disagreeable physical feelings, bodily feelings. So as long as the body stands, one still can get ill, sick. One could undergo injuries, bodily injuries. And so in this sense, as long as the body stands, one is exposed to disagreeable or painful bodily feelings. And then just the very fact that the body and all the things experienced through the body is impermanent and conditioned, this is considered dukkha in a subtle way. It's not the gross type of suffering. Okay, now the person who's reached the end of suffering, we could say, he continues to live on, and as long as he continues to live on, he'll experience painful bodily feelings and still continue to maintain this body which is imperfect, subject to decay, to old age, and to death. And so that is the aspect of dukkha that remains, but one could still say that this one has made an end to dukkha in this present life, in that he's cut off the possibility of any dukkha arising in the future. This is the way I would understand it, because there's no more possibility of a future rebirth.
But I guess the understanding I have is that the source of the cause of dukkha is clinging, and let go of the clinging.
Yeah.
And I understand that you would have pain, but would you necessarily have aversion to the pain, or the thing that causes the second dart? You know, the second dart wouldn't occur.
No, the second dart doesn't occur.
But the first dart is still considered dukkha?
It's, in the broad sense, it's considered dukkha. It comes under the heading of, actually in two senses. First, it comes under the heading of what's called dukkha dukkhata, which means the suffering that consists in painful feeling. So one still has the bodily painful feeling, though there's no negative mental reactions to it. And then it also comes under sankhara dukkhata, which is the suffering or the unsatisfactoriness bound up with conditioned phenomena. Just the fact that these phenomena are conditioned states. This is something which is considered what makes it dukkha. There's a simile that illustrates this aspect of dukkha, this dukkha dukkhata. I actually saw it in the commentary to Nagarjuna's Madhyamaka Shastra, Chandrakirti's commentary, but it must come from an earlier source. It says that this aspect of sankhara dukkhata is like let me see how they put it. Okay, for an ordinary person, it's like a hair which is on the hand. If we have a hair on the hand, we almost don't feel anything there. But if we get that little hair in the eye, then it's it's painful, and we just can't do anything else. All we think about is how do we get this hair out of the eye. This is the way the Aryans, the noble ones, experience the sankhara dukkha. For them, just the conditioned phenomena are felt to be unsatisfactory. So it doesn't mean that they are actually that they're experiencing painful feelings because of the conditioned phenomena, but they just perceive the conditioned phenomena to be unsatisfactory, and so they delight in, whenever they can, to going into and experiencing the nirvanic peace here and now, sort of withdrawing the mind from its involvement with sensory objects, sensory experiences, and drawing back into the nirvanic peace. Yeah.
Could you explain the difference of...
Speak a little more loudly. It's on, but you could speak.
Could you explain the difference of 6 door and 6 base?
They're actually the same thing, the 6 doors and the 6 sense bases. It's just that the metaphor is different. Yeah, we have the expression. Usually when the Buddha is speaking in terms of contemplation, developing insight, or about the origination of experience, he uses the word ayatana, base. I think with the meaning that these are the bases for consciousness. He uses the expression, I don't even know that we find the expression 6 doors in the suttas. There might be a later term, a later expression coming from the commentaries. But we do find in the suttas the expression gutadvara, which means guarding the doors, which means, it does mean guarding the doors of the sense faculties. So when the expression doors is being used, the particular context in which it occurs is the need to exercise restraint over the sense bases, or over the sense faculties, because it's through the contact of the sense faculties with their objects that let's put it this way, it's the contact of the 6 sense faculties with their objects that triggers the arising of covetousness and dejection, or greed and aversion. And so the use of the expression 6 doors, or guarding the doors of the sense faculties, the context where that is used is restraint of the senses, whereas the expression the 6 sense bases is used in more philosophical texts, which show how experience originates, and also the texts concerned with the development of insight, which show how one should contemplate the 6 senses in order to put an end, a complete end, to greed, hatred, and delusion.
So in the sutta, there is no words like panchadvara in sutta itself.
Panchadvara I don't recall occurring in the suttas. Or chadvara would be the 6 doors. I'm not saying that it's not there, but I don't recall it being there. I would have to do a kind of search of the Tripitaka to make sure.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Okay, Richard.
It's a question about craving and clinging and clinging is said to be the cause of dukkha, and
Yeah.
but craving seems to be what leads to clinging.
Yeah.
So, do both end? Do both craving and clinging end?
With the full development of wisdom?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, both craving and clinging end. Clinging, we could say, we could understand as a kind of strengthening of craving. Or if we want to distinguish that, maybe we could say that craving more specifically means the desire for what one does not have, and then clinging means holding to what one has already acquired. Though sometimes the two are not so sharply differentiated. Okay, there's one question sent over the internet. Okay, the question is, for the abandoning of the all, is jhana the requisite for abandoning of the six senses and viraga? Okay, this leads into a little bit of a different question, from what I'm dealing with here, and that is the question whether jhana is necessary for attainment of. Sometimes the question is whether jhana is necessary to achieve stream entry, whether it's necessary to achieve arhatship. And then so many different people have different opinions about that question, and the arguments become very intense, very heated. I know monks who are almost not talking to one another because they have different answers to these questions. If my answer goes out over the internet, there'll be people attacking me, others will be applauding me. Okay, the way I understand it, I just state my opinion. From what I could see from the suttas, that jhana is not necessary to achieve the first of the four levels of enlightenment. It's not necessary to achieve the first two levels, the level of stream entry and the level of once returner. Because we find people like householders like Anathapindika, Visakha, who is always delighting in her children, grandchildren. Anathapindika was a millionaire who was involved in making money and more money. They became stream enterers, maybe once returners, and they're assured of a heavenly rebirth. But one doesn't get the impression that they're intense meditators going off to develop jhanas. It seems to me, from my reading of the Sutta Pitaka, that the point where jhana becomes important, maybe essential, is in making the transition from the stage of once returner to the stage of non-returner. But the commentaries, both in the southern tradition, the Pali tradition, and in the northern tradition also, the tradition of the Sarvastivadins, recognize the possibility of achieving even arhatship without the attainment of jhana. This is called the Panya Vimutta Arhat, the wisdom liberated Arhat. And the Pali commentaries have a special term, Sukha Vipassika, the dry insight Arhat. So this is one who achieves arhatship through the power of wisdom without basing it upon the attainment of the jhanas. There's no explicit mention of the dry insight Arhat in the suttas, but there are some texts in the suttas, some suttas, that the commentaries interpret to be evidence for the existence of dry insight Arhats. The most famous example is the Susima Sutta. This is Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 12, sutta number 70. Okay, any further questions on this? Okay, this is a question. So is the strategy for abandoning, say, craving through the six senses to be out of sight, out of mind? That is, like, avoiding seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. This isn't the Buddha's strategy. In the Buddha's time, there were some ascetics who had the idea that the way to master the senses is avoid as much as possible any kind of sensory contact. So maybe they would put we call these blinkers, or blindfolds over the eye, stuff the ears with the earplugs. I don't know, they have to breathe through the nostrils, can't stop the nose. They still have to eat, so they'll taste the food. Maybe they just ate very bland food. And of course they have to touch things, but they wouldn't touch anything essentially exciting. But this wasn't the Buddha's way. The Buddha rejected this approach. This comes in Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 152, the last sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya. And the Buddha's way is through controlling the mind through mindfulness and the contact with the sense objects. So one sees forms, hears sounds, but one doesn't grasp upon the attractive or repulsive features of the sense objects. But one uses mindfulness and clear comprehension to understand that these objects are just sense objects, that they arise and pass away. And so with this understanding, then one doesn't get spun around by the objects. Okay, we'll move on now to the next text. This is on page 348, selection number E in this subsection. Okay, so here a monk named Udayi comes to Venerable Ananda and says, in many ways, the nature of this body has been declared, disclosed, and revealed by the Buddha thus. For such and such a reason, the body is non-self. Is it possible to explain consciousness in a similar way to show how consciousness is non-self? This is an extremely important topic because there is a sutta. It occurs in Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 12, I think it's number 71, or could it be 73, where the Buddha says that it is better to take the body to be self, but not the mind. Because this body is seen to last for a day, a night, a year, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, but what is called mind, citta, or thought, mano, or consciousness, vijnana, that arises and passes away constantly, moment after moment, day and night. Okay, so how does one show or demonstrate that consciousness is non-self? Okay, so Venerable Ananda is going to argue or show this by using the conditioned origination of consciousness as the reason why consciousness is non-self. Okay, so doesn't I consciousness arise in dependence on the I in forms? The answer is yes. If the cause and condition for the arising of I consciousness would cease completely and totally without remainder, would I consciousness be discerned? And then the answer is no. And so Ananda says, in this way, or for this reason, we can demonstrate that consciousness is non-self. I think the sense here is that I consciousness a particular act of eye consciousness arises in dependence upon the eye and in dependence, let us say, a moment in the existence of the eye. And it also arises in dependence upon a particular visible form. Now when we look at the eye with insight, we see that the eye is arising and passing away, constantly arising and passing away. And the form that is being cognized is also arising and passing away. And so for this reason, the act of consciousness that arises based upon a particular moment of the eye and based upon a particular momentary form, that occasion of eye consciousness passes away with the passing away of that eye and that form. It might be followed by a new moment of eye consciousness arising. It might be followed by a new moment of eye consciousness, but that new moment of eye consciousness will arise based upon a new occasion or new moment of the eye and based upon a new visible form. And so we see our experience to be continuous, to be something constant and continuous. But when we pay very close attention with mindfulness to any occasion of experience, we could see how that experience is actually a process made up of moments of experience which are constantly arising and passing. And so because eye consciousness depends upon the eye and depends upon forms, at that moment when the eye passes away, when the forms pass away, the same moment of consciousness cannot continue existing. But that consciousness also dissolves and passes away, followed by another moment of consciousness, then another moment of eye consciousness, another moment of eye consciousness. This is the way I would understand it, but this expression that it would cease completely and totally without remainder, it almost seems some might take it to mean that this occurs only at death, with the death of the body. You're shaking your head like this. Okay, so you would agree with the way I would interpret. I'm just saying that some might interpret in that way. Okay, so then Ananda uses a simile to illustrate this. He says, suppose a man needing heartwood, that's solid wood, seeking heartwood, wandering in search of heartwood, would take a sharp axe and enter a forest. Then he would see the trunk of a large banana tree, straight, fresh. We already had the simile of the banana tree in relation to the aggregate of mental formations. Maybe some of you who grow up in America never traveled to the tropics, have never seen a banana tree. But if you cut down a banana tree, or if a banana tree falls down, and you examine it, you see that it just exists of coils. One coil enclosing another coil, enclosing another coil. A little bit similar to the way an onion consists just of layers, one layer enclosing another, enclosing another. And so if you cut through the banana tree looking for solid heartwood, you never find it. All you find are these coils wrapping, one coil wrapping around another coil. Okay, so the man cuts down the banana tree at the root, cuts off the crown, and unrolls the coil. And as he unrolls the coils, he would not find even softwood, let alone hardwood. And so, a monk does not recognize or perceive a self or anything belonging to a self in these 6 bases for contact. Since he does not recognize anything thus, no self there, he does not cling to anything in the world. Not clinging, he is not agitated. Actually, I think this word paritasati really is a verb related to craving. He does not have any craving. Being without craving, he personally attains Nibbana. He understands, destroyed is birth, the spiritual life has been lived, what had to be has been done, what had to be done has been done. There is no more coming back to any state of being. Okay, so this is the demonstration of how consciousness is non-self because of its base, because the consciousness is based on the 6 inner and outer sense bases. The 6 inner and outer sense bases are impermanent. That which arises based on the impermanent is also impermanent. And that which is impermanent cannot be a self. Okay, any questions on this passage?
Okay. I have a question about the term 6 bases for contact.
Yeah.
Does it include 18? Because I know 6 bases could be 6 or 12, depending if
Yeah.
you want to include the internal ones and the external ones. But when you say there's 6 bases for contact,
Yeah.
does it refer to 18?
To 18.
Yeah, including the eye consciousness and ear consciousness, because contact is there.
Yeah, but the expression 6 bases for contact is referring only to the 6 internal bases. But they're called pasayatana, bases for contact, because it's through these sense bases that contact occurs. But the bases themselves, the bases for contact, are just the 6 bases.
Not even the 6 external ones.
No. They're just the 6 internal sense bases. Any further questions? Okay. If no further questions, did you have another question?
I have one question is about the previous passage.
Okay, that's all right.
How could forms be burning with lust and hatred, unless forms have external objective?
Okay, that's a good question. How can forms externally be burning with greed, hatred, and delusion?
I'd like to know the definition of forms in Buddhism. Do forms have external objective existence?
Do they have existence apart from the act of perception? Let us say that the Buddha doesn't really deal with this question in a kind of philosophical way, the way we deal with it in Western philosophy, in which case, in Western philosophy, it always leads to an insoluble problems. When different thinkers, they raise the question, do there exist objects apart from the perception of them? So how does one know that an object exists? One could only know that something exists through the perception of it. This came down in the popular form some years ago with the riddle, when a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody there, does it make a sound? If nobody is there, then how does one know whether it makes a sound or not? To say that there's a sound there, you need somebody who's hearing it. But if somebody is hearing it, then you can't say that there's nobody in the forest. Okay, so the Buddha doesn't deal with this question whether things exist apart from the act of perceiving them. But it seems from a practical angle, the Buddha sometimes speaks, or the Buddha's texts sometimes speak, as though the objects exist prior to the act of perceiving them. So we have independence on forms, independence upon the eye and forms. Eye consciousness arises, and dependence upon the ear and sounds, ear consciousness arises. So a passage like this seems to be treating forms, sounds, odors, tastes as things that can have an existence prior to the awareness of them, the act of being conscious of them. But even though the texts speak in this way, I don't think we should then jump to a kind of philosophical conclusion. Therefore, there are forms, sounds, odors, tastes, before somebody is aware of them. It's just, I think, that this is just going along with a conventional way of speaking, without making any kind of philosophical commitment to either an idealistic epistemology, theory of knowledge, or a realistic theory of knowledge. Okay. Okay. But then the question is, how are forms, sounds, odors, tastes burning with greed, hatred, and delusion? Okay, well, I don't have very much attachment to this writing instrument, but somebody gave me this very nice, very high quality, what do you call this, recording device? MP3 recorder. The MP3 recorder doesn't have greed, hatred, and delusion in itself. But if you get near it and seem like you're going to take it away from me, Bhante will get angry, right? Why does Bhante get angry? When Bhante gets angry, what is going through his mind? What? Yeah, but what mental state particularly? Well, before the clinging. Well, let's say when Bhante gets angry, if the three, greed, hatred, delusion, what is there immediately?
Burning. Burning.
What?
Burning.
Burning with what?
With hatred.
Hatred or anger. Dosa could be hatred, anger. But when somebody is taking the instrument away and Bhante is burning with anger, what was there before somebody took it away? Greed or clinging to it. So it's not that the recording device itself has greed, hatred, and delusion, but it's really the mind based upon the form that has greed, hatred, because of the delusion, this is mine. Okay, so the same is with all of the other sense objects. In themselves, maybe there is somebody has dropped a tape player in the forest. He's not aware of it, he dropped out of his knapsack, and when it fell to the ground, it hit the play button. And now the tape player is playing the most exquisite music. but nobody is there to hear it and to become enchanted with the music. And so there's no greed arising any place, no attachment to the beautiful music. So the instrument in itself doesn't have greed, hatred, delusion. Form, sound, smells, taste don't have greed, hatred, and delusion. But it's the mind that has the greed, hatred, and delusion in regard to those objects. Okay, let us pass on now to the next section. Okay, now we've finished with the 6 sense spaces, and I've gone through them a little bit quickly. I just wanted to take a selection of text illustrating each of these schemes. So to find all the suttas dealing with the 6 sense spaces, you can look in the Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 35. This has about more than 200 suttas on the 6 sense spaces. Now we come to the third scheme, which is called the dhatus, which means, or we translate as elements. Okay, the Buddhist suttas use different numerical schemes of elements. You sometimes have 18 elements, 4 elements, 6 elements. So I took a few texts to illustrate the different groups of elements. So the first one we have here are the 18 elements. The 18 elements are obtained by taking the 6 internal sense spaces, the 6 internal sense spaces, 6 external sense spaces, and then the 6 types of consciousness that arise based on them. And then those 6 types of consciousness are also called elements. Okay, so we have, the Buddha says, I will teach you the diversity of elements. We have the I element, form element, and I consciousness element. Then we have the ear element, sound element, ear consciousness element, nose element, odor element, nose consciousness element. And so with the tongue, with the body, then interestingly we have the mind element, the mental phenomena element, and the mind consciousness element. So this is called the diversity of elements. I think the first 15 are pretty self-evident, pretty clear. We come to a little bit of a problem. We have mind element and mind consciousness element. What is the relationship between them? What is the distinction? Interestingly, the suttas themselves don't answer that question. They leave it almost as though it's evident, almost as though this listener will understand what is meant by the difference between mano dhatu, the mind element, and mano vijnana dhatu, mind consciousness element. We find some distinction made in these between mind element and mind consciousness element in the Abhidhamma, which uses a very technical scheme to explain the difference. And I'm not really sure whether the Abhidhamma here is completely in accord with the early teaching. It seems to be developing a more theoretical way of understanding the functioning of the mind. But I would just try to understand this maybe in a more common sense way, without bringing in this technical method of explanation. The mind element we could understand as maybe the faculty of thought, the faculty of mental cognition. And then mind consciousness element is the awareness of thought, the awareness of cognition. So let us say I'm trying, just as example, I'm trying to work out a mathematical formula 2 plus 2 divided by 3 equals what? Okay, so I'm thinking 2 plus 2, that equals 4. And I think divided by 3, 3 goes into 4 one time, that leaves over 1. So it's 1.33333. So all of this I'm thinking. That thinking is the work of mano. And then while I'm thinking this, there is the awareness of what I'm thinking. That is mano vijnana dhatu. We could just leave it simply at that. Okay, so these are the 18 elements. Then we come to a scheme of 4 elements. Okay, what is it? Let's take the meaning of this word element, dhatu. The Pali word dhatu is derived actually from a verb which means to support, to dhati, or to place, to put. But the commentators derive it from the verb dharati, which means to hold or to support. So the word dhatu is taken to mean something which supports or upholds a particular property, particular characteristic. So each of these 18 dhatus, 18 elements, has its own distinctive property, distinctive quality, and that is what makes it a dhatu, an element. Then we come to 4 material elements. The 4 material elements are the earth element, the water element, the heat element, and the air element. According to Buddhist philosophy, these 4 material elements are the basic constituents of all matter. And the Buddha would have taken over these 4 terms from the contemporary Indian philosophy. It was just like part of the widespread background Indian religious belief that the material world was made up of these 4 elements. But the Buddha gave these terms a particular special significance within the framework of his own teaching. The earth element is that property of matter by which matter has substance, by which matter occupies space, by which matter has some degree of hardness or solidity. So if we compress any kind of material object, we meet with resistance. Even if we take something which is soft, very flexible, we compress it, so it becomes harder and harder and harder. We eventually reach a point where we can't compress it any further. What prevents that compression, what gives that resistance, this is the earth element. And the earth element is considered the foundation for all other material phenomena. The second element, the water element, has the characteristic of flowing, fluidity. And it also has another property, which is the property of cohesion, of binding together. I think that the early Buddhist philosophers came to this conclusion from observing the way the Indian women prepare chapati. You know what chapati is? It's a kind of flat bread, somewhat like the dough of the pizza. So, if you ever see a man in the pizza shop making the pizza, what does he do? First he puts the flour out on the board, right? And what does he do after that? He adds water. If he just takes the flour, doesn't add water, and starts kneading the flour with his hands, what will happen to the flour? Yeah, the particles of flour, they won't stick together. So what enables them to stick together is the addition of the water. So maybe when they observe this, the great Indian philosophers watching the village woman making the chapati, they came to the conclusion that water has the property of binding material particles together. So this is, maybe it's like, they call them, I think, gluons in modern particle physics. It's a kind of force that binds the quarks together. Okay, so we have the earth element with the property of supporting or resistance, hardness, solidity. The water element, which binds together. The fire element doesn't necessarily denote a blazing fire, but all material substances have the property of heat. And so that which gives heat to matter is the fire element. If the fire element is more prominent, then the object becomes hotter. During the summer, the sun is stronger, and so in our atmosphere, the fire element is more prominent. During the winter, the sun is more distant, and so the fire element is more recessive, and so the air becomes cooler. And so this spectrum between heat and cold, this measures the degree of prominence of the fire element. In our own bodies, we also experience the fire element as the bodily heat. And then the fourth element is the air element. The air element is also called wind. And the Buddhist philosophers came to the conclusion, when the wind is blowing, there is motion. And the winds blow sometimes in one direction, sometimes in another direction. And so motion back and forth is the characteristic of the presence of the wind element. And also when wind blows, there comes something expands in the wind. When the air is still, the leaves of the tree might be hanging down. But when the wind blows, the leaves of the tree get lifted up and spread out. And so the Buddhist thinkers came to the conclusion, the wind element has the property of expansion, distension. And so when the wind element is prominent, expansion takes place. When the wind element recedes, contraction takes place. And so we can observe this in breathing. When we breathe in, the lungs fill with air and the chest expands. When we breathe out, the air leaves the lungs and the chest contracts. And so expansion and contraction, or motion back and forth, this becomes the mark of the air element. And so then, according to the Buddhist thinkers, all four elements are present in every material particle, whether a speck of dust, a solid rock, a stream of water, a blazing fire. a gust of wind. In all of these, all four elements are present simultaneously, mutually conditioning one another. The earth element is what contributes the degree of hardness or solidity to this material body. If the earth element is reduced or is present in a low degree, then we get softness or mobility in the object. If the earth element is dominant, then the object is hard and solid. Okay, so that's the presence of the earth element. Then the water element is the property of what binds the particles of the object together. The heat element, the fire element, is the heat that pervades the particle of matter. And the air element accounts for the fact that any particle of matter is constantly moving back and forth, or expanding and contracting, even below the threshold of ordinary perception. And so even this solid writing, this solid pen, solid plastic, we have the earth element accounts for its solidity. The water element is what binds the particles, the molecules together. It has some degree of heat, and those particles are vibrating back and forth, expanding, contracting, expanding, contracting. That's the air element. Okay, so then the Buddha says, here I just strung together a number of suttas, combined them, dealing with the four elements. So I think these are all dealing with, or most of them are dealing with the gratification triad. So those ascetics and Brahmins who do not know as they really are the gratification, danger, and escape in the case of the four elements, these I do not consider to be ideal ascetics, ideal Brahmins, and they have not realized for themselves with direct knowledge the goal of the ascetic life or the goal of Brahmanhood. But those ascetics and Brahmins who understand gratification, danger, and escape, these are the ideal ascetics, the ideal Brahmins, who have reached the goal of asceticism and Brahmanhood in this life. Okay, so that's gratification, danger, and escape. Then the same thing is stated in the next sutta in regard to the five aspects. Those ascetics and Brahmins who do not understand as they really are the origin and the passing away, the gratification, danger, and the escape. Same thing said. Then the third sutta phrases this in terms of the Four Noble Truth pattern, the Four Truth pattern. Those ascetics or Brahmins who do not understand the earth element, its origin, its cessation, and the way leading to its cessation, those are not ideal ascetics and Brahmins. But those ascetics and Brahmins who understand the four elements in this way, what they are, their origin, their cessation, and the way to the cessation, these I consider ideal ascetics and ideal Brahmins. Okay, I think we'll stop the explanations here, and if there's any questions, then please feel welcome to ask. Okay, Richard?
I don't understand the gratification, danger, and escape.
But maybe we should just
The gratification.
no, let the gong finish ringing.
I don't understand the gratification, danger, and escape in the case of the four elements. How that comes into the...
Okay, the gratification would be the fact that usually when we relate to material things, we don't think of them in terms of the four elements. But what it means basically, the gratification means finding pleasure and joy out of things experienced through the senses, material things experienced through the senses, material things that are compounds of the four elements. Okay, the danger would be the fact that all of these material things are impermanent, subject to change, and if one clings to them, then it will give rise to suffering. And then the escape would be putting away the chandaraga, desire and attachment to these things.
So there's not a separate gratification danger for each of the four elements as they composite as a material form. We have gratification, danger, and escape.
Well, it's the same for all of them. It's whatever pleasure and joy one obtains from each one of them. That would be the enjoyment in it, or the gratification. The fact that these things are all impermanent, that is the danger. And the putting away of desire and attachment, that is the escape. But analytically, one could take each element individually and then reflect in this way in regard to it. But normally in our experience, we don't think in terms of becoming attached to earth element, becoming attached to water element, to fire element, to air element. Okay, let me just take quickly these written questions. Okay, what is an example of an external mind object that is not sight, sound, smell, and so on? You see, actually, this is a technical expression used in the text. All of the elements are considered external. Even the mind objects, which conventionally we would say they're internal. Thoughts, ideas, images, judgments. These are acts, mental acts, or objects of mental acts. And so, in our English way of expression, we say they're internal. But in the Buddhist philosophical way of speaking, the six sense faculties, which are the subjective instruments of cognition, these are called internal. And then the objects are always called external. So the five physical sense objects will always be called external, even though I might be attached to, say, my own form. Somebody is proud of their beautiful face, and so they have craving for their own facial features. Well, usually one doesn't see one's face except in a mirror when it becomes external. But let's say I have a very strong body, which I can see. It's still internal in that it's mine, but in that it's an object of cognition, it's external. And the same applies to the ideas in the mind. Technically, they're classified as external, even though they occur within my own mind. Okay, second question. How are mind elements considered external? Seems they are all internal. Did we come across the expression external mind element? I don't recall coming across the expression mind element external. Okay, yeah.
Is the memory, consciousness too? Memory.
Okay, is memory an act of consciousness?
Yes.
Yeah, memory would be an act of consciousness. Memory would involve the coming together of a number of elements. In terms of the aggregates, I would say one can't reduce memory just to one aggregate, one out of the 5 aggregates. But in memory, perception plays a very important role, sanya. Because sanya is that mental function through which we can identify the characteristics of things. And so when we use sanya, perception, to identify the characteristics, that serves as a basis for memory. So when I see something on a later occasion, my mind focuses on the same characteristics, and in this way I can remember it. And so sanya is important in memory, perception. But whenever perception occurs, there's always consciousness along with it. So we could also say that memory is an act of consciousness. So memory is quite a complex phenomenon with many components to it. Okay, we'll end now and then we'll come back at 12 o'clock, and if there's any other questions or any points to discuss, we can discuss them then. Okay, let us end with the sharing of the merits. Okay, so I'll recite according to the verses on the sheet. Akasata Chabhumata Deva Naga Mahidika Punyantang Anumoditva Chiram Rakantu Sasanam Akasata Chabhumata Deva Naga Mahidika Punyantang Anumoditva Chiram Rakantu Desanam Akasata Chabhumata Deva Naga Mahidika Punyantang Anumoditva Chiram Rakantu Mam Param Eta Tatacha Amhehi Sampadam Punya Sampadam Sabbe Devanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Eta Tatacha Amhehi Sampadam Punya Sampadam Sabbe Bhudanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Etavata Hehi Sampadam Punya Sampadam Sabbe Satanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Papagupadhaya Vichihitato Etantare Satakaya Papanna Rupya Rupicha Sanya Samino Dukkha Pamuchantu Pusantu Nibuting